and welcome to this video where we're going to sew the Adélaïde pattern together. This is a pattern for a slipover, pullover vest or bib with pretty details and perfect finishes. It has plenty of volume and can be worn easily over a blouse, t-shirt, light sweater, or even on its own. Fully trimmed or lined, you can choose whether or not to add ruffles for a very trendy look. We have reinterpreted this design in our own way with different options to offer you a unisex pattern for babies from 6 months to 4 years. Let's review the technical features of this pattern together. This garment is made up of an outer fabric and a lining. This gives the slipover a good shape, allows it to be interfaced and quilted, and even makes it reversible. The two fabrics are either assembled together on the wrong side before being turned right side out or stitched together and trimmed with bias binding. As an option, ruffles can be added to the lined version. The neckline is always finished with visible bias binding, which can be cut from the main fabric, the lining, or purchased ready-made. The neckline is open at the center back or at the shoulder so that the slipover can be slipped on easily. The version with a shoulder opening is trimmed and is not compatible with ruffles. The garment closes at the sides with 2 ties or buttons. This garment is assembled entirely on the sewing machine. No serger is needed. Since the raw edges of the fabric are all unclosed in seams, it is not necessary to overcast or overlock the edges. You can still do this if your fabric frays a lot. The skill level is easy. This pattern is not very complex, but it does require a little attention to detail, especially when applying the bias binding. As usual, if you take your time and work carefully, everything will turn out fine. The easiest version to sew is lined, without ruffles, with an opening at the center back. This is the one we recommend if you are new to sewing. Let's take a look at the choice of fabrics. This pattern is designed with 2 fabrics, one for the outside and one for the lining. Both fabrics should be cut from woven, not knitted materials, but almost anything can be used. It is also possible to choose a knit fabric, which will be worked like a woven fabric, as the pattern does not require elasticity. However, be careful. If you choose to make your own bias binding or sew ruffles, opt for a fairly thin fabric that can be gathered easily. For temperate seasons, you can use poplin, seersucker, chambray, waffle fabric, linen, jersey, eyelet embroidery, or terry cloth. For winter, go for corduroy. Sweatshirt fabric of varying thicknesses, sherpa, gabardine, denim, flannel, or canvas. For a bib version, choose terry cloth, waffle fabric, or even coated fabric. You can also choose to sew the slipover in a quilted fabric or make your own quilting. In this case, I strongly recommend watching our technical video dedicated to this technique. You'll find lots of useful tips for your project. The ties are designed to be cut from the main fabric, the lining, or a contrasting fabric. Choose a thin fabric to avoid extra thickness that is difficult to sew. You can also choose a pre-folded bias binding that matches your fabric. In this case, you will need to work with it as if the ties were cut from the main fabric. You can also choose ties or ribbons. You won't need many supplies. 2 20mm buttons if you choose the button side option, and a little woven iron on interfacing to reinforce the buttonholes. You will need a 12 x 20 cm rectangle. You can also choose slightly smaller buttons. If you choose the center back opening, you will also need 4 cm of round elastic cord and a small button. For the shoulder opening version, you will need a 20mm button, a snap fastener, or a hook and loop fastener. If you are making a bib version, use a snap fastener or a hook and loop fastener. We also need bias binding for the neckline, the edge of the garment, and the shoulder if you have chosen these options. We started with store-bought bias binding, but you can easily make your own using your fabric, lining, or a contrasting fabric. In this case, cut 4 cm wide strips from the bias of your fabric, then fold them in half lengthwise. Use the same amount of fabric as indicated for the store-bought bias binding. Let's take a look at 2 different versions to see the different results. Let's start with this large check gingham version with ruffles and lined with off-white washed linen. The garment is open at the back and fastens with a button and loop, as well as 2 ties at the sides. The neckline bias binding is made from the outer fabric. Next, we have a trimmed version made from Liberty fabric and lined with striped poplin. We chose to trim the garment with bright blue bias binding. The slipover is closed with two 20mm buttons on the sides. This version is open at the shoulder and fastens with a 20mm snap button. Before starting to assemble the garment, we will address a few specific points concerning the cutting of the pieces. Depending on the neckline opening you choose, the pieces will not be identical. If you choose the center back opening, the front should be cut on the fold. The back should be cut in two. If you choose the shoulder opening, the front is cut flat with one rounded shoulder and the other straight. The back is cut on the fold. For both versions, the front and back are cut from the main fabric and the lining. The neckline bias binding and the bias binding for the trimming are intended to be cut from pre-folded bias binding available in stores, but can be cut from the main fabric or the lining. This uses a little more fabric, but the result is very high quality. The neckline bias binding piece is included on the pattern and measures 4 centimeters in height. You can use this piece to cut the bias binding for the trim, which should also measure 4 centimeters in height, but much longer. This is why we have not provided a specific piece for the binding, as it can measure up to 3 meters, which would not have been economical in terms of paper. For the ties, you can choose to cut them from the fabric or use commercially available ribbons or bias binding, which can be worked as if it were fabric. If you choose to cut the bias binding for the neckline and trim from your fabric, you must start by cutting and preparing these bias bindings. For this version, you will need between 2 and 3 meters. For precise measurements, please refer to the Fabric and Supplies Requirements table, but you may need to assemble several pieces to obtain the required length. Cutting from a single piece may increase fabric consumption considerably. We recommend that you allow for a little extra bias binding, which you can then trim to avoid running out in the middle of your project. To make your own bias binding, you will need to draw and cut 4 centimeters wide strips on the bias of your fabric. I use a patchwork ruler to draw my lines, which is very handy as the diagonals are marked on it. You can also make your own tool by drawing a square and its diagonals. This will help you position your ruler. Once I have traced the bias binding on my fabric, I cut my strips. We will then see how to assemble them. Start by taking the two ends of the bias binding and joining them together, making sure they are aligned with the grain line. It is important that both ends are beveled in the same direction so that they can be joined together correctly, like this. Place the two bias strips with right sides together and align the edges at the ends. Be careful to align the edges at the sides 1 centimeter from the stitching. Pin in place, then stitch 1 centimeter from the edge. Next, open the seam with an iron, trim off the corners, and voile. You now know how to join bias binding. Now we're going to iron the pieces that need it. I've decided to group everything together at the beginning, so I can do it all at once. I like doing it this way because it's more efficient to iron the pieces one after the other while the iron is still hot. Once all the pieces are ironed, all that's left to do is sew. For store-bought bias binding, start with the neckline, trim, and shoulder, which you will fold in half using the folds you already made. If you have made your own bias binding, fold it into quarters. To do this, start by folding your piece in half with the wrong sides together. Then open the bias binding and fold the ends toward the center. For the ties, which are cut on the grain line, make a 1 centimeter fold on one of the ends. Repeat this step on the other 3 ties. We will also fold the 4 ruffles in half with wrong sides together. Finally, use interfacing to reinforce the buttonhole areas on the lining, following the pattern markings. This will ensure that they are strong and durable over time. Depending on your fabric, it may be necessary to interface the shoulder placket. We will now begin assembling the garment. If you have chosen to close your front panel with ties, we will first finish preparing them. To do this, fold them in half with right sides together, making sure that the folds at the ends are neat. Pin them in place, then stitch at 7 millimeters from the edge. Be careful to leave a long thread at the end of your stitching before cutting, as shown here on this tie that I have already sewn. Next, press the seam open with an iron before trimming the seam allowances to 5 millimeters. This will reduce any excess thickness. Then turn the ties inside out. To easily turn small pieces like these, I like to do the following. I use the thread from the seam, which I slide into the tie to turn it inside out. I use a needle through which I pass my thread and slide it into the tie. To make it easier, I pass the eye of the needle through first. Then, I gently pull on the thread to turn the tie inside out. It can be a little difficult at first, but after that, it's easy. Once the tie is turned inside out, I can cut the thread. Now carefully iron the tie, making sure that the stitching is aligned with the folds. If necessary, roll the fabric between your fingers to make it stand out, like this. There you go. My 4 ties are ready. I'll put them aside for now. We will first assemble the shoulders and back, then the versions with a center back opening, lined and trimmed. Finally, we will cover the version with a shoulder opening, which will necessarily be trimmed in a separate chapter. If you have chosen the version with a back opening, start by placing the 2 back pieces of outer fabric with right sides together. Align the edges and the end markings for the center back slit, then pin in place. Stitch between the markings and the bottom of the back 7 millimeters from the edge. Open the seam with an iron. Be careful to also iron the folds in line with the seam on each side of the back. Take care, as this step is important for achieving a nice slit in the center back. Then proceed in the same way with the lining. Next, place the front and back pieces of outer fabric with right sides together. If you have chosen the version with a back opening, align the edges of both shoulders, pin, then stitch 7 millimeters from the edge. If you have chosen the version with a shoulder opening, align the right shoulder seam when worn, not the rounded one at the front. Pin and stitch 7 millimeters from the edge. Open the seams with an iron, then repeat the process symmetrically on the lining. There you have it. My 2 pieces are assembled. Let's start by preparing the ruffles, if you have chosen this option. Assemble the ruffle pieces to form a large circle. To do this, place one end against the end of another piece with right sides together and stitch 7 millimeters apart. Repeat 3 times to form a large circle, then open the seams with an iron. Fold the large ruffle in half with the wrong sides together and iron the fold. As this has already been done when preparing the pieces, it's easier and quicker. I only need to mark the fold at the assembly seams. Now we're going to gather the strips. To make this easier, I prefer to divide my gathers into 4 equal lengths. This prevents me from having to start all over again if a thread breaks, and I find it easier to start the gathers this way. We give you all our tips in our dedicated technical video, which I invite you to watch before you start sewing the ruffles. I stitch the gathering threads between each assembly seam. To make the gathers, I lengthen the stitch on my sewing machine to the maximum and reduce the tension. I sew 2 lines of gathers, leaving a long length of thread at the beginning and end of the seams, 1 stitch at 5 millimeters and 1 at 1 centimeter. Above all, I do not make a back stitch at the beginning or at the end. Once I have finished my 8 seams, I distribute and pin the gathers. Start by laying the outer fabric flat with the right side facing up. Then place the ruffle against the outer fabric with the right sides together. The ruffle's assembly seams should be aligned with the shoulder seams and the center front and back of the lining. Pin in place. Next, pull the bobbin threads to begin gathering the fabric until the ruffle is the same length as the area where it will be sewn. There are 2 options for doing this. The first is to gather everything, then place the ruffle on the bodice and stitch everything at once. The second, which I will use, is to gather and pin 1 half, then gather the second half. This step takes a little longer, but it's really worth taking your time and being careful, as this is what will ensure that the gathers turn out well in the end. Once the gathers are the right length, I secure the gathering threads around the pins by wrapping them around them in a figure of 8. This helps to maintain the length of the ruffle and distribute the gathers more easily. I then distribute the gathers so that the volume is even and uniform. I pin gradually to hold everything in place. I make sure to place my pins perpendicular to the edges. This helps to distribute the gathers evenly and also makes it easier to sew over them. I continue until the entire ruffle is pinned. Once the ruffle is in the right position, I stitch 5 millimeters from the edge to hold it in place. You can stitch over the pins if they are perpendicular to the sewing line. To do this, don't sew too quickly. There you go, it's stitched. My ruffles are held in place, so I repeat the process to attach the ruffles to the second half. Then we can move on to assembling the lining. We will now move on to assembling the lined version with and without ruffles. The lined version must open in the middle of the back. Start by placing the lining flat with the right side facing up. If you have chosen a side closure with ties, position them at the pattern markings. The edges must be aligned with those of the body, and the seam joining the ties must be facing downwards. Pin in place. If you have opted for a button closure, there is nothing special to add. Then place the outer fabric body with right sides together on top of the lining, sandwiching the ties between the two pieces. If you have chosen the version with ruffles, these should be sandwiched between the lining and the outer body. Align the edges and pin all around the garment. Stitch 7 millimeters from the edge. Notch the curves. If necessary, trim the seam allowances to 5 millimeters. Turn the garment inside out through the neckline. Make sure all the curves are neat. Then iron carefully. If visible, remove the gathering threads from the ruffles with a seam ripper. There you have it. Your front panel is almost finished. All that remains is to finish the slit in the center back and the neckline with the neckline bias binding, which we will see in the dedicated chapter. This chapter only applies to the trimmed version with a center back opening, which must be without ruffles. For this video, we used images from the Brisbane pattern, Adelaide's big sibling. That's why there is no slit in the back opening, but the assembly for this chapter is identical. Start by placing the lining on the outer fabric with the wrong sides together. Align the edges and pin in place. Optionally, you can top stitch all around the pattern at 5 millimeters. If you have chosen a side closure with ties, place them at the pattern markings on the right side of the lining. The edges must be aligned with those of the body, and the seam joining the ties must be facing downwards. Pin in place. If you have opted for a button closure, there is nothing special to add. Place the bias binding with the right sides together with the lining. Position the end with the fold already made at one side of the back, as this is where it will be least visible. Pin the bias binding open all around the garment. Once you reach the first end of the bias binding, place the second end with the wrong sides together with the first, overlapping by 2 centimeters. Cut off the excess tape, then stitch in the hollow of the bias binding 1 centimeter from the edges. Take your time with the curves. This is the most technical step. You can stretch the bias binding slightly if necessary. It will easily return to its original shape afterwards. Here, I am stretching the bias binding a little so that it fits the curve. Once the seam is done, I can easily put it back in place with a little steam from the iron if necessary. This is why we use bias binding, so that the ribbon has a little flexibility. Once the seam is stitched, iron with the bias binding facing outwards. Then, still using the iron, fold the bias binding in half, straddling the edge. Normally, if you have ironed well at the beginning, this is easy to do. It is in the curves that more precision is required, but by taking your time and using the steam from the iron, everything will fall into place. Next, pin the bias binding to the right side of the garment. To make sure it is positioned correctly, I stitch the two layers together and check that the pin falls in the hollow of the first stitch of the bias binding. For the ends, I first fold the bias binding over the edge without any fold, then cover it with the folded edge. This is the result. The finish is clean and neat. If you have ironed it well, it does not create too much thickness. You can also choose to baste the bias binding with contrasting thread and large slip stitches, but in my case, this isn't necessary. If you've chosen to close the front panel with ties, fold them toward the outside of the garment. This will catch them in the top stitching and hold them in place. Then stitch 1 millimeter from the edge of the bias binding. This seam is important because it will be very visible on the finished garment. That's why we prefer to sew the bias binding on the wrong side first, then top stitch on the right side. You could start by stitching on the right side and top stitching on the wrong side, but personally, I find it easier the other way around. You can also use other techniques. It's up to you to decide which one you prefer. Take your time, and if you're not happy with the result, don't hesitate to unpick and start again. That's why we prefer to do it on the right side. There you go, our front panel is almost finished. All that's left to do is finish the neckline with the neckline bias binding. For the option with an opening in the center back, we still need to finish the slit and the neckline with a bias binding. Let's start with the slit. The two back pieces are already sewn together. Align the neckline edges and the center back pleats of the outer fabric and the lining. The markings for the end of the slit are superimposed. Pin in place. We will stitch around the slit 1 millimeter from the edge, like this. Start on the left side when worn, go down to the bottom of the slit, leave the needle in place, lift the presser foot, and stitch the work 90 degrees. Lower the presser foot, then stitch 3 stitches. Lift the presser foot again, leaving the needle in place, then rotate the work and stitch up to the top of the right side. And there you have it, our slit is finished and very neat. We will now move on to assembling the neckline bias binding. If you want to add a size label, now is the time to do it. Here, I place my label on one of the sides of the back on the right side of the lining. Pin it in place. Place the right side of the neckline bias binding against the wrong side of the neckline, leaving 1 centimeter at the beginning. Pin in place, then stitch along the first fold of the bias binding from one end to the other. The neckline bias binding piece is slightly longer to allow for a margin. Now finish the ends of the bias binding. Fold the bias binding into an accordion shape as shown here. The bias binding is folded in the center with right sides together, and the halves are then folded with wrong sides together. Hold with a pin. Before stitching, insert the loop on one side. The length of the loop depends on the button, but I like to start with a final size of about 1 centimeter, which fits a wide range of diameters. So I take a piece of elastic cord about 4 centimeters long and fold it in half. I slide it into the end so that the edges are aligned and the loop is facing the garment. I pin the future seam and turn it over to get an idea of the final result. This allows me to adjust it as I wish. Here, I find it still a little too big, so I'm going to reduce it a little and test it again to see if it suits me. Once it's right, I'll use a clip to hold the loop in place. We can now stitch the two ends in line with the center back. It's important to sew precisely and avoid any misalignment at the base, as this may be visible when you turn the strip over. On the side where the loop is, I don't hesitate to sew back and forth several times to reinforce it. You can also reduce the length of the stitch to make the seam stronger. I highly recommend this tip. You can now trim the seam allowances at the neckline to 4 millimeters. This is a really important step because it makes it easier to position the bias binding at the end. I trim the seam allowance at the neckline only, not the band. At the assembly seams, I don't hesitate to trim the seam allowances because that's where there is the most thickness. At the ends, I trim off the corners and also reduce the seam allowance. Now turn the neckline bias binding to the right side of the garment. Take care to turn the corners properly. If you have ironed the binding well beforehand and trimmed the seam allowances, the binding will fall into place easily. From here, there are two options. The first, which I will use, is to pin the binding evenly along the neckline. But if you prefer, You can baste the strip with contrasting thread and large slip stitches instead of pinning it for an even more precise result. This is ideal for fabrics that move and don't allow for sufficient precision. You can then stitch as close to the edge as possible. Here is what it looks like once stitched. On the right side, the stitching is even and looks nice. Here is what it looks like on the wrong side. The stitching is not exactly perfect because it is sometimes just below the bias binding, but this is not visible as it is on the wrong side. This stitch is one of the most delicate to do on the entire pattern, and the main thing is that the result looks good on the right side of the garment. This section is for the version with an open shoulder, trimmed and without a ruffle. Start by placing the lining on the outer fabric with the wrong sides together. Align the edges and pin in place. Optionally, you can top stitch all around the pattern at 5 millimeters. If you want to add a size label, now is the time to do it. Here I place my label in the middle of the back, on the right side of the lining. Pin it in place. We will start by trimming the edge of the garment, then we will take care of the shoulder. If you have chosen a side closure with ties, place them at the pattern markings on the right side of the lining. The edges should be aligned with those of the body, and the seam joining the ties should be facing downwards. Pin in place. If you have opted for a button closure as shown here, there is nothing special to add. Place the bias binding with right sides together. Pin the bias binding open all around the garment, starting at the left shoulder, continuing down the back, and finishing at the second shoulder end. Be careful when passing the left shoulder at the front, as this is a little tricky. You can help yourself by ironing the bias binding with steam to shape it slightly so that it fits this small curve. Then stitch in the hollow of the bias binding 1 centimeter from the edges. Take your time with the curves. This is the most technical step. You can stretch the bias binding slightly if necessary. It will easily return to its original position afterwards. Let me show you. Here, I am distorting the bias binding slightly so that it fits the curve. Once the stitching is done, I can easily put it back in place with steam from the iron if necessary. This is why we use bias binding, so that the ribbon has a little flexibility. Once the seam is stitched, iron again with the bias binding facing outwards. Then, still using the iron, fold the bias binding in half, straddling the edge. Normally, if you have ironed well at the beginning, this is easy to do. It is in the curves that more precision is required, but by taking your time and using the steam from the iron, everything will fall into place. Then pin the bias binding to the right side of the garment. At the ends, the bias binding should stop at the edge of the back shoulder. This is what it looks like. You can also choose to baste the bias binding with contrasting thread and large slip stitches, but in my case, this isn't necessary. If you have chosen to close the front panel with ties, fold them toward the outside of the garment. They will then be caught in the top stitching and held in place. Next, stitch 1 millimeter from the edge of the bias binding. This seam is important because it will be very visible on the finished garment. This is why we prefer to sew the bias binding on the wrong side first, then top stitch on the right side. You could start by stitching on the right side and top stitching on the wrong side, but personally, I find it easier the other way around. You can also use other techniques. It's up to you to decide which one you prefer. Take your time, and if you're not happy with the result, don't hesitate to unpick and start again. Now we need to finish the back shoulder, which is still raw. Place the bias binding with the right sides together with the lining, pin in place, then stitch in the hollow of the bias binding. Now we're going to finish the ends of the bias binding. Fold the bias binding like an accordion, as shown here. The bias binding is folded in the center with right sides together, and the halves are then folded with wrong sides together. Hold with a pin. Now you can stitch the two ends. It is important to sew precisely and avoid any misalignment at the base, as this may be visible when you turn the strip over. At the ends, trim off the corners. Now turn the bias binding to the right side of the garment. Take care to turn the corners properly. If you have ironed the bias binding well beforehand, the strip will fall into place easily. Pin it in place, then stitch as close to the edge as possible. There you go, it's stitched and our garment is almost finished. Start by sewing a button opposite the loop for the back opening. If you have chosen the version with an opening at the shoulder, you can embroider a buttonhole on the front, attach a snap button, or sew a hook and loop fastener on the left shoulder when worn, according to the pattern markings. For the side closure, if you have chosen buttons and buttonholes, it is time to embroider the buttonholes on the front, following the pattern markings. Sew the buttons on the opposite side. Depending on the size, you can sew more than one button on each side or have several small buttons along the entire length. It's up to you. If you want to make a reversible version, you will need to sew buttons on both sides of the fabric, opposite each other. And there you have it. Your Adélaïde slipover is finished. Here are 2 examples of possible finishes, showing how different the results can be. Depending on the fabrics and options you choose, your creation will be practical and easy to use while remaining very cute. This pattern offers many possibilities, so you shouldn't get bored making it. If you liked this video, please like and subscribe to our channel. We can't wait to see your versions, so head over to Instagram with the hashtag #IkatiAdélaïde. See you soon at Ikati.